70,000 years ago at exactly 4:47 a.m. local time, the Earth tried to kill every human being on the planet. In a single, cataclysmic moment that lasted less than 2 weeks, Mount Toba in northern Sumatra unleashed the most violent volcanic eruption in human history, an explosion so massive it makes every nuclear weapon ever built look like a firecracker. The supervolcano didn't just erupt, it literally blew itself apart, ejecting 670 cubic miles of rock, ash, and magma into the atmosphere with the force of 3,000 thermonuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. To understand the sheer scale of this disaster, imagine every building in Manhattan suddenly launched 20 miles into the sky, and multiply that by 1,000. That's roughly equivalent to the amount of material Toba hurled into Earth's atmosphere in just 14 days. The explosion was heard across half the planet, in what is now India, 1,200 miles away. The sound arrived like thunder that lasted for hours. Trees were stripped bare by the sonic boom. Animals fled in panic, and early human settlements were abandoned as people fled the deafening roar, coming from an invisible source beyond the horizon. But sound was just the beginning of the terror. Within hours of the eruption, a wall of superheated gas and rock traveling at 400 miles per hour swept across Sumatra, incinerating everything in its path. The pyroclastic flow was hot enough to melt copper and fast enough to outrun any escape attempt. Every living thing within 60 miles of Toba was killed instantly, their bodies vaporized by temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The immediate kill zone covered an area larger than the state of Florida, but this was only the start of a global catastrophe that would push humanity to the very edge of extinction. As billions of tons of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide blasted into the stratosphere, they began forming a reflective veil around the entire planet. Within days, this ash cloud had spread across Southeast Asia, turning day into night and raining down volcanic debris that buried entire landscapes under feet of gray powder. The ash was so thick that it blocked out 99% of sunlight across Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. People couldn't see their own hands stretched out in front of them during what should have been bright daylight. But the horror had only just begun. The volcanic material didn't stop in Southeast Asia, carried by high-altitude winds. Toba's ash spread across the entire Indian Ocean, covering India and Pakistan in a layer of volcanic debris up to 20 feet thick in some areas. Archaeological evidence shows that human settlements across the subcontinent were abandoned almost instantly as people fled the advancing wall of ash and darkness. The Toba ash layer, still visible today in geological cores, marks one of the most dramatic population crashes in human prehistory. As the weeks passed, the atmospheric effects became global. Sulfur dioxide from the eruption formed sulfuric acid droplets in the stratosphere, creating a reflective barrier that prevented sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. Global average temperatures dropped by up to 21 degrees Fahrenheit, the most rapid climate change event in human history. The northern hemisphere was hit especially hard, with some regions experiencing temperature drops of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Summer disappeared entirely in many areas, replaced by a perpetual volcanic winter that would last for 6 years. The ecological collapse was swift and merciless. Without sunlight, photosynthesis ground to a halt across vast areas of the planet. Forests began dying within months, starting with the most vulnerable species and cascading through entire food webs. Grasslands turned into barren wastelands. Rivers and lakes began freezing in regions where ice had never formed before. The monsoon systems that billions of plants and animals depended on simply stopped functioning, creating massive droughts in areas not covered by ice. For the scattered human populations of 70,000 years ago, this was an extinctional-level event that made survival nearly impossible. Imagine stepping outside tomorrow morning and discovering the sun had been replaced by an impenetrable gray ceiling that blocked out 90% of all light, and the temperature had permanently dropped 20 degrees. Now imagine that nightmare lasting not for days or weeks, but for 6 entire years. This was the reality faced by every human being alive during the Toba volcanic winter, a global catastrophe that transformed Earth into an alien world where survival required skills and cooperation that most of our ancestors didn't possess. The first challenge was simply seeing Volcanic ash made the air so thick that visibility dropped to just a few feet even during what should have been bright daylight. People had to navigate by touch, following riverbanks and familiar landmarks that were rapidly disappearing under layers of gray powder. The ash wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Breathing the fine volcanic particles caused severe respiratory problems, and many people died from what was essentially silicosis, their lungs scarred and destroyed by inhaling glass-sharp ash fragments. But the darkness and toxic air were minor problems compared to the cold. As global temperatures plummeted, regions that had never experienced freezing weather suddenly found themselves trapped in perpetual winter. In Africa, where most human populations were concentrated, temperatures dropped so severely that high-altitude areas experienced snow and ice for the first time in thousands of years. The Sahara Desert, already expanding due to climate changes, became even more hostile as temperatures made survival nearly impossible even for the hardiest desert peoples. The collapse of food systems was swift and complete. Plants that depended on photosynthesis began dying within weeks of the eruption. Fruit trees stopped producing. Grasslands withered and died, taking with them the herds of animals that human hunters depended on for protein. In coastal areas, the cooling oceans disrupted marine ecosystems, causing massive fish die-offs that eliminated another crucial food source. Humans accustomed to relatively abundant natural resources suddenly found themselves in a world where finding enough calories to survive required traveling enormous distances and taking desperate risks. Starvation became humanity's greatest enemy. Archaeological evidence from this period shows clear signs of nutritional stress in human remains. Bones show evidence of stunted growth in children, suggesting that even those who survived often went hungry for extended periods. Tooth enamel analysis reveals periods of severe malnutrition that would have affected cognitive development and overall health. Many human groups that had thrived for generations were completely wiped out, leaving behind only scattered tools and abandoned cave sites as evidence they ever existed. The psychological impact was devastating. Humans 70,000 years ago were already intelligent, socially complex beings with rich cultural traditions and spiritual beliefs. Suddenly finding themselves in a world where the sun rarely appeared and familiar landscapes had been transformed beyond recognition must have been psychologically shattering. Many groups likely interpreted the volcanic winter as evidence that the world was ending, and in many ways they were right. The social structures that had evolved over thousands of years began breaking down as groups were forced to make impossible choices between sharing scarce resources or preserving their own families. Competition for the few remaining safe havens became fierce and often violent. Groups that had coexisted peacefully for generations were suddenly competing for caves, water sources, and the few remaining areas where edible plants could still be found. Archaeological evidence suggests that warfare and conflict increased dramatically during this period, as desperation drove normally cooperative communities to violence. Yet it was also during this darkest period that human ingenuity and cooperation reached new heights. The survivors who made it through the Toba winter did so by developing new technologies, forming larger cooperative groups, and pushing the boundaries of human endurance and creativity. They learned to preserve food for much longer periods, developed better clothing and shelter technologies, and created more sophisticated hunting tools that could take advantage of the few remaining animal populations. Most importantly, they began migrating in ways that had never been attempted before. As traditional territories became uninhabitable, human groups were forced to undertake epic journeys across continents, following the few remaining corridors where survival was possible. These migrations weren't just movements of people. They were desperate searches for any environment where human life could continue. Some groups pushed further south in Africa, seeking refuge in areas where temperatures hadn't dropped as severely. Others moved toward coastal regions where marine resources might still be available. The most adventurous began exploring new territories entirely, possibly including the first serious attempts to leave Africa and colonize other continents. The 6-year volcanic winter created evolutionary pressure unlike anything humans had ever faced, and the species that emerged from this crucible was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. When the ash finally settled and the sun began breaking through the volcanic haze 6 years later, Fewer than 10,000 humans remained alive on the entire planet. These survivors, scattered across a few refuges in Africa and possibly small populations in Asia, carried in their DNA the entire future of humanity. What they didn't know was that their near extinction had just created the genetic foundation for every person who would ever live, and that their shared trauma would actually accelerate human evolution in ways that would ultimately lead to our domination of the planet. The Toba bottleneck created the most severe genetic restriction in human history. To understand just how extreme this population crash was, consider that there are more people living in a single city block in Manhattan today than existed in the entire human species after Toba. Genetic analysis of modern humans reveals that all 8 billion people alive today descended from those roughly 10,000 survivors, making humans the least genetically diverse large mammal on Earth. You have more in common genetically with someone from the opposite side of the planet than two chimpanzees from the same forest have with each other. This genetic similarity isn't just a curious fact, it's evidence of humanity's shared brush with extinction. But the bottleneck effect did more than just reduce genetic diversity. It fundamentally changed the trajectory of human evolution by creating intense selective pressure for traits that promoted survival in extreme conditions. The humans who survived Toba weren't just lucky. They were the ones with the specific genetic and behavioral characteristics that made long-term survival possible under the most adverse conditions imaginable. Intelligence became more crucial than ever before. The survivors were those who could problem solve under pressure, innovate new technologies rapidly, and adapt to completely new environments. The cognitive abilities that we consider uniquely human, including abstract thinking, long-term planning, and complex communication, may have been directly selected for during the Toba crisis. Brain development requires enormous amounts of calories, but the survivors were those whose enhanced cognitive abilities more than compensated for the metabolic cost. Cooperation became essential for survival in ways it had never been before. Individual families or small groups couldn't survive alone in the post-Toba world. The survivors were those who could form larger, more complex social groups that shared resources, coordinated hunting and gathering activities, and cared for vulnerable members during times of scarcity. The genetic basis for human empathy, altruism, and complex social behavior may have been strengthened during this period because groups with these traits had better survival rates than more individualistic populations. The bottleneck also accelerated human migration and cultural development in unprecedented ways, with traditional territories destroyed or uninhabitable. The survivors were forced to become more mobile and adaptable than any previous human populations. They developed new tools, clothing, and shelter technologies that allowed them to survive in a much wider range of environments. Most importantly, they began the migrations that would eventually populate the entire planet. Some genetic evidence suggests that the first successful migrations out of Africa occurred shortly after the Toba eruption. It's possibly driven by the need to find new territories as traditional homelands became uninhabitable. The psychological impact of shared trauma created what researchers call cultural amplification. The survivors carried not just genetic material but also cultural knowledge, stories, and technologies that had been tested under the most extreme conditions possible. The myths, legends, and cultural practices that emerged from this period emphasize themes of survival, cooperation, and adaptation that became central to human identity. Many creation stories from cultures around the world contain echoes of a time when the world was covered in darkness and humanity nearly perished, possibly preserving cultural memories of the Toba catastrophe. Modern genetic analysis has revealed the remarkable precision with which we can trace this bottleneck. Mitochondrial DNA studies show that all modern humans can trace their maternal lineage back to a small number of women who lived through the Toba period. White chromosome analysis reveals a similar pattern for paternal lineages. These genetic signatures are so clear that scientists can identify not just when the bottleneck occurred, but approximately how severe it was and how long it lasted. The irony of the Toba catastrophe is that it may have saved humanity from evolutionary stagnation. Before Toba, human populations were relatively stable and geographically isolated, which could have led to genetic drift and reduced evolutionary pressure for the traits that made modern human civilization possible. The near-extinction event, forced rapid evolution, migration, and cultural development that might have taken hundreds of thousands of years under normal circumstances. In trying to kill us, Toba created us. The 10,000 survivors who emerged from the volcanic winter weren't just the ancestors of all modern humans. They were the carriers of evolutionary innovations that had been forged under the most extreme selective pressure imaginable. Their descendants would go on to populate every continent, develop agriculture, build civilizations, and eventually develop the technology to understand the very catastrophe that nearly destroyed their ancestors. Today, every time you meet another person, you're encountering someone who shares the genetic legacy of those 10,000 Toba survivors. A reminder that all of humanity is connected by our shared brush with extinction 70,000 years ago.